Welcome to the debate. When you look at a highly detailed video game, you see this vibrant, chaotic world, right? It is full of characters, weather systems, complex narratives.
Right, a whole simulated reality.
Exactly. But beneath the rendering, it is entirely rigid. It is just cold code, ones and zeros. Physics engines bounded by absolute, hard-coded mathematical rules. And today we are asking a massive question. Is our reality exactly the same? And if it is, who wrote the code?
Yeah, and if you were a character inside that software, right, and you suddenly gained awareness, you would probably look at the sky of your digital world and invent mythologies to explain the rendering limits. You would look at the edge of the map and call it magic, simply because you couldn't see the servers humming in the background.
Which brings us right to the heart of our discourse today. We are exploring the fundamental nature of reality, human suffering, and the origin of morality. And we are doing this by placing classical Islamic theology into direct conversation with modern secular frameworks, specifically evolutionary biology and simulation theory. I will argue that reality is a purposefully designed moral test run by an all-merciful creator, where human free will and objective justice perfectly align.
And I will argue that the actual mechanics of reality, marked by profound, unpreventable suffering and strict physical limits, point to a completely indifferent system. Whether we understand that system as a blind biological accident or a massive technological simulation run by an entirely uninvested programmer.
So let's start by laying out our foundational worldviews here. How do you interpret the architecture of this reality we find ourselves in?
Well, I look out at the world, and I start with the raw data, not the theological assumptions. And, the data tells a very specific story. The world is fundamentally saturated with suffering. We aren't just talking about a little friction here and there. We are talking about children starving. We are talking about bone cancer. We are talking about natural disasters that wipe out hundreds of thousands of lives in a matter of minutes.
Right. The scale is massive.
Exactly. And the classical framework you are presenting posits an all-powerful, all-merciful God. But the Epicurean paradox dismantles this completely, in my view. It asks a very simple, devastating question. If this creator can stop the suffering and chooses not to, he is not merciful. If he wants to stop it but cannot, he is not all-powerful.
Okay.
Therefore, the concept of a God who is simultaneously omnipotent and infinitely loving is logically incompatible with the world we actually live in. When you look at the sheer volume of both moral and natural evil, and remember, this suffering existed for millions of years in the animal kingdom long before humans even arrived, reality is much better understood as a mechanistic, indifferent system.
I see.
We are either looking at biological evolution, where morality is merely an adaptive survival tool for primates, or we are in a high-level technological simulation where atoms are just pixels and the programmer is entirely indifferent to our existence.
I see the weight of that argument. I really do. And I understand why the scale of suffering leads you to that conclusion. But I want to offer a framework that doesn't ignore that data, but contextualizes it.
Okay, let's hear it.
The universe is not a cold, indifferent machine. It is a highly deliberate, highly calibrated environment designed specifically for the exercise of ikhtiyar, or free will. The friction of reality that you see as proof of indifference, the pain, the limitations, the scarcity, is actually the necessary terrain of a moral test.
A test?
Yes. The Quran establishes the premise of its existence very clearly in Surah Al-Mulk, chapter 67, verse 2, stating that the Creator is the one who created death and life in order to test which of you is best in deeds. You view the friction of reality as a glitch in the machine. I argue it is the only environment where true moral agency can exist. Furthermore, adopting the language of modern technology, or simulation theory, doesn't negate the creator. I believe it perfectly maps onto the theological frameworks that have been held for 1,400 years. In this view, divine revelation acts as a necessary README file, or like a patch update, designed to guide our simulated free will toward what we might call base reality.
Okay, but let's take your premise of a deliberate test.
Why must the parameters of this test be so incredibly brutal?
How so?
Well, if there is an advanced programmer, a master coder, why wouldn't he simply hard-code humans to be empathetic and peaceful? If he is the ultimate designer, the sheer amount of moral evil we see, war, murder, greed, suggests a massive flaw in the design.
Right.
If you build a system where the components frequently tear each other apart, and you have the power to code them differently, allowing that unprevented suffering makes the designer either cruel or utterly apathetic to the creation.
Well, think about the mechanics of code for a second. If I program a robot, right, I write a script that forces it to look at me every morning and say, I love you. Does that robot actually love me?
No, obviously not. It is just executing a command. It is syntax without semantics.
Exactly. And for those listening who might not be familiar with that phrase in computer science, it means the robot is following the grammatical rules, the syntax, without actually understanding or feeling the meaning, the semantics. Forced goodness destroys the very concept of virtue.
Okay, but
We have to look at the ontological value of goodness meaning, the actual fundamental reality of a thing. For concepts like love, bravery, compassion, and justice to possess any actual reality, the possibility of their opposites absolutely must exist.
So evil is a requirement for good to exist?
Yes, you cannot be brave if there is no genuine danger. You cannot choose good if you do not have the capacity to choose evil. In the Islamic framework, free will is described as a massive, consequential burden. Surah al-Lahab, verse 72, mentions that this trust of free will was offered to the heavens, the earth, and the mountains, and they declined to bear it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they refused because the risk of failure was too high, but humanity took it on. The moral evil you are pointing to, the wars, the cruelty, is not a coding flaw by the Creator. It is the human abuse of that heavy trust.
I hear what you are saying about the robot. And, I can grant you, for the sake of argument, that human beings are responsible for human evil. If a dictator starts a war, that is the abuse of free will. Fine.
Right.
But that analogy breaks down for me when you look at the scale of the damage that has absolutely nothing to do with human choices. You are sidestepping the other half of the Epicurean paradox, natural evil.
Ah, natural evil.
Yes. What about the viruses? What about the tectonic shifts? An earthquake that collapses a building on sleeping innocents has nothing to do with human free will. The planet itself kills its inhabitants. How does a supposedly merciful creator justify the mechanics of a world where the stage itself crushes the actors?
That is, yes, the transition from moral evil to natural evil is the true crux of the issue. And to understand it, we have to examine our own epistemological limits, the limits of what we can possibly know.
okay.
You are looking at a singular event, a disaster, a disease, and declaring it an absolute objective evil. But you are judging the infinite wisdom of a creator using a finite, profoundly limited human perspective. Let me offer an analogy. Imagine a small child standing in an operating room watching a surgeon cut open a patient's chest. What does the child see?
Well, the child sees trauma. They see a horrific act of violence being committed against someone who is unconscious.
Precisely. The child sees bloodshed. But a medical student standing in that exact same room sees a life-saving quadruple bypass. The physical action is exactly the same, but the knowledge surrounding the action changes its reality entirely. Humans, in relation to the Creator's design, are like that child. We see the cut, but we do not possess the infinite perspective required to see the cure. The Quran addresses this limitation directly in Surah al-Baqarah, verse 216. It says, "But perhaps you hate a thing, and it is good for you, and perhaps you love a thing, and it is bad for you. And Allah knows, while you know not."
The surgeon analogy is incredibly clever, I'll give you that. But it contains a critical structural flaw.
Which is?
A human surgeon cuts open a patient because the surgeon is bound by the limits of human biology. The surgeon has to cause pain to heal because they aren't omnipotent. An all-powerful God wouldn't need a scalpel. He wouldn't need a tsunami or pediatric leukemia to achieve a greater good.
I see your point.
But, let's follow your logic for a moment. If, as you say, we are like children who cannot see the cure and our perception of what is harmful might actually be a hidden good, then how can we trust our perception of morality at all?
How do you mean?
I mean, if we cannot truly know what is good or bad because we lack infinite perspective, then morality doesn't require a divine architect to explain it. Evolutionary biology explains it much more efficiently. Morality is just biological game theory.
Biological game theory?
Yes. Reciprocal altruism isn't just a theory. We observe it in primate populations right now. Ancestral tribes that developed cooperative behaviors, empathy, sharing food, protecting the weak, they survived and passed on their genes. Tribes that just murdered each other died out.
Right.
It is a highly efficient biological survival mechanism. It doesn't require an objective truth handed down from a creator. It just requires the biological imperative to survive.
Okay, but here is the problem with that framing. It creates a pretty massive logical contradiction in your own worldview, I think.
How so?
Well, if human beings are merely biological accidents, right, like just the byproduct of blind evolutionary forces pushing us to survive, then morality is completely subjective. It is just a chemical illusion in our brains to keep the species propagating.
Well, it is a chemical illusion, yes, but a highly effective one.
But if it is just a chemical illusion, why do you feel profound, absolute moral outrage when you see a child starving or a dictator committing genocide? If you are listening to this right now and thinking, well, I don't believe in God, but I still know murder is objectively wrong, you have to ask yourself why you know that.
Because of empathy.
But if it's just biology, then a human dictator wiping out a weaker population is absolutely no different than a lion eating a gazelle or a stronger chimp killing a weaker chimp. It is just nature taking its course. It is just matter in motion.
I see where you're going with this.
Right. You do not look at a war and say, well, that is just atoms rearranging themselves according to evolutionary pressures. You call it wrong. You call it evil. You are borrowing the concept of objective morality, which requires a moral lawgiver, to argue against the existence of that very lawgiver.
That is an interesting reframing.
In classical Islamic theology, we explain your outrage through the concept of fitra. Fitra is the soul's innate, hardwired inclination toward ultimate truth and goodness. Even if you intellectually deny the Creator, your soul still recognizes objective justice, because as Surah Al-Sajda verse 9 states, the Creator breathed into him of his soul. You recognize the brokenness of the world precisely because you were designed with an internal blueprint of perfection.
Okay, but even if I can see that our biology evolved to fuel a deep sense of empathy, biology is ultimately just downstream of physics. And when we look at the physics of the universe, the actual source code of reality, we do not see a loving God communicating through a mystical blueprint. We see hard-coded, indifferent constants. We see simulation theory. We look at the universe and we see the fine structure constant.
Wait, let me make sure I understand what you are implying here. Are you saying that because the universe has mathematical limits, like a video game's frame rate, that proves we are just software?
I am saying that when we look at the fine structure constant, which is basically the fixed mathematical rule that dictates exactly how light and atoms interact, it looks exactly like the parameters a programmer sets when building a physics engine.
Okay.
The speed of light functions exactly like a universal rendering limit. Atoms behave essentially as quantum pixels. We are existing in a highly complex mechanistic software. Now, I can concede the possibility of a programmer of this software, but a programmer doesn't need worship.
Well,
A simulation is just an experiment, a massive crunching of variables. Why would a being capable of simulating 1 trillion galaxies care if the localized string of code in a bipedal avatar eats pork or bows in the direction of a specific coordinate on a small rock? Assuming the programmer cares about human rituals is just a massive projection of human ego.
Notice what just happened, though. For decades, the mechanistic, atheistic worldview insisted the universe was a random, chaotic accident. Now, through the lens of computation and physics, you are looking at the exact same universe and admitting it exhibits perfectly tuned, hard-coded design. You have simply changed the word God to programmer.
Well, it is not just a name change. A programmer implies technical architecture and observation. not divine intervention, moral judgment, or a demand for submission.
But let's apply your own technical logic to the simulation. If a programmer writes a massive open-world AI simulation, does he just generate the code, hit run, and walk away while the characters glitch, degrade, and destroy each other?
Not if it's a closed system, no.
No. In software development, you send a patch update, you provide documentation so the system runs as intended. And our framework, Revelation, the text, the prophets, is that README file. It is the set of instructions provided so the localized AI realizes what it is and how to function optimally within the software.
A divine README file.
Exactly. A very word Islam translates to submission. In your tech terminology, submission is simply the act of syncing your local drive with the main server. The rules you dismiss as pointless rituals, the dietary laws, the physical coordinates of prayer, are the synchronization protocols. And what's remarkable is that the Quran explicitly described worldly life in these exact computational terms 1400 years ago. Surah Al-Ankabut, verse 64 states, "This worldly life is but an amusement and a game."
Okay, I will give you the sinking concept. That is a fascinating way to visualize theology. But here's my issue with that mapping. It raises a massive structural question about human consciousness.
Go on.
If I am just data, just processing power, executing a script in a simulated environment, what is a soul? Data doesn't have a soul. It is electricity and logic gates. It exists only as long as the hardware has power. When the hardware degrades, the data is gone.
Think about how modern gaming and cloud computing work. When you turn off a console, does the character you were playing cease to exist?
The local instance of it does, yes.
The local manifestation on your screen disappears, exactly. But the data, the progression, the essence of that character is saved on the cloud. The physical human body is merely the avatar, made of clay in the classical language or pixels in yours. What we call the soul is your core character data.
So death is just a disconnect?
Death is not game over. Death is simply the moment of disconnecting from the temporary simulation and returning to what you would call base reality, and what the theology calls al-akhirah, the hereafter. Furthermore, the concept of a master server holding all data perfectly mirrors Lauh al-Mahfuz, the preserved tablet in the Islamic tradition, where every single line of code, every action you take, is securely stored and recorded.
All right, let's look at that master server concept, because it brings us right back to the flaw in the system.
Okay?
If this is a test, and the programmer wants us to sync with the server, why the massive delay in the feedback loop? If I write a code that violates the syntax, the compiler throws an error immediately. It tells me on line 42 that I made a mistake. It doesn't wait 80 years.
That is a fair question.
Right? If God wanted us to believe and follow the rules, he could provide instant justice, strike the liar with lightning the moment the lie is told. Waiting for an afterlife, waiting for this base reality, is like being promised a check in the mail. It is an unverified promise that allows injustice to thrive in the present.
But if lightning strikes you the exact moment you lie, you don't get a moral awakening. You just get an avoidance reflex. You remove the entire mechanism of human growth.
How so?
Well, a person needs time to see the consequences of their lie, to feel the guilt, to rationalize it, and ultimately to repent or to double down. If justice were instantaneous, obedience would be driven entirely by immediate physical terror. It would be classical conditioning, like training a dog. It would not be moral agency. The delay, the silence of the server as you perceive it, isn't a glitch. It is the exact psychological space required for actual character to be forged. It is the space where free will operates.
But you have to acknowledge that this space for character to be forged comes at a terrifying cost. It comes at the cost of the innocent. While the tyrant is exercising his free will, utilizing his time to grow or not grow, the victims are being crushed by it.
Which is exactly why the theological framework demands the day of judgment. Without the transition to base reality, the mechanistic universe you advocate for is profoundly structurally unjust.
Unjust?
Yes. Think about it. In a purely biological or uninvested simulation model, a tyrant like Nero or Hitler simply powers down. The victims power down, both meet the exact same end, nothingness. The ledger is never balanced. But Islam provides a framework where absolute mathematical justice is served. Surah al-Zalzala verses 7 and 8 states that whoever does an atom's weight of good will see it, and whoever does an atom's weight of evil will see it. The delay is not an absence of justice. It is the gathering of the data for the final rendering, where no action goes unpatched and no victim is left uncompensated.
But you are still operating on a staggering assumption. You are assuming the data will be read. You are assuming the server isn't just going to wipe the hard drive at the end of the experiment. Even if I accept the internal logic of your simulation, it still feels like a monumental gamble. What if you're wrong? What if the mechanics of the universe are just mechanics, the code has no author, and there is absolutely nothing after the screen goes black?
If I am wrong, then I have lived a life disciplined by synchronization protocols. I have practiced charity, maintained community, restrained my impulses, and sought truth. And when the screen goes black, I simply cease to exist, exactly as you do. I lose nothing. But if viewing reality through the logic module provided by the Creator reveals the actual truth, if this is a perfectly synced system of free will, objective morality, and ultimate justice, then the stakes of the simulation are infinite.
That is a very Pascal-esque way of looking at it.
It is, yeah. And we've covered immense ground today. To summarize where we stand, I maintain that reality is a deliberate, precisely engineered environment designed for moral agency, where the objective parameters of right and wrong are provided by the Creator, and where ultimate justice is guaranteed in base reality.
And I maintain that the sheer, staggering volume of unpreventable suffering, combined with the cold, unyielding mechanics of either a biological or simulated universe, leaves the concept of an intervening, merciful Creator as an unsupported human projection. The hard rules exist, absolutely, but they do not care about us.
Yet, in our discourse, we actually find a profound area of convergence, I think. We both agree that the universe operates on stunningly precise, hard-coded rules.
We do.
We both agree that understanding our source code is the ultimate human pursuit. Our fundamental disagreement simply rests on whether that code includes a purposeful moral framework and a promised return to the author.
That is an accurate assessment. We are looking at the exact same data, the exact same rendering of the world, but interpreting the intent of the architecture in completely opposing ways.
And perhaps that is the ultimate test of the logic module we've been given. I will leave you and our listeners with a final thought drawn directly from the material we analyzed today, specifically referencing the wager presented in Surah Fussilet, verse 53. If we are indeed existing inside a construct of immense, unfathomable complexity, and artificial intelligence denying the existence of the coder while utilizing the coder's own logic gates to make that denial might just be the ultimate logic error.
That is certainly something to process.
The value of examining these profound concepts from multiple perspectives really cannot be overstated. When we pull back the curtain on reality, whether we see raw mathematics or divine architecture, we are forced to reckon with our place in it. Keep exploring the material, test the logic, and decide for yourself whether you are looking at raw science or the signature of a creator. The ones and zeros are waiting.